Hello, everyone. Welcome to the BARI conference. Welcome to a Walkable Future panel. We're glad to have you. We're going to give everyone another minute or two to find their seats and get comfortable, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to a Walkable Future panel. I'm going to introduce our esteemed moderator, executive director of Livable Streets, Stacey Thompson.
Thank you so much, David. And thanks to everyone who's joining us for this conversation today. I think it's a very exciting way to start a Friday leading into the weekend. And I'm not going to take too much time setting up the panel. If you're here, you know that we are here to talk about a walkable future. And I'm going to guess that folks who are here are urbanists who might understand that you know, any urban setting, any community is more than buildings and streets, right? It's sort of that mix of a connective tissue that fits just right, that feels good, and that's sometimes intangible. It's sometimes hard to quite sort of explain why strolling down Beacon Street feels good and why walking down Columbia Road feels uncomfortable, why you enjoy certain spaces in the city and why other spaces just don't feel right. And so what I love about this session today is that our great panelists have done research that sort of help us get one step closer to quantifying that feeling of what a great walkable, equitable community might be in the future and what it is today. So I am not going to spend a lot of time introducing our session. What I'm going to do is turn this over to David. We're going to go through each pre-recorded presentation, and then I have questions for our panelists, and I would really encourage you to share your questions throughout as well, and I will capture those questions and be sure to pepper them into our discussion today. So I'm not going to say more than that. I think we should jump right in so we have plenty of time to have a great conversation today.
Hello everyone, my name is Fernando Yu. I will be presenting the ongoing research at Aretian Urban Analytics and Design titled Urban Design Impacting the 15-Minute City. This is joint work with Jeremy Burke, Ramon Grass, and Jordan Kruger. We are researchers at Harvard University interested in studying urban phenomena. We begin the analysis by considering the radical concept of the 15-minute city. This 15-minute city model purports a view of a city where most of the population lives within 15 minutes of the main amenities that they need for a high quality of life and most of the urban infrastructure. This has added benefits not only in terms of quality of life, but also in the efficiency of energy use and general urban infrastructure use. We see that there are striking differences across cities, not only in terms of their urban planning initiatives, but also on the street layouts and their city design layouts. So here I'm presenting some examples of these idealized typologies of city layouts, of which maybe the grid one is the most popular, of which Manhattan is a good example. The fractal city is another example here. Barcelona is a good example of a fractal city. The radial city, a third example, of which Paris is a good representative of the radial city. The question here is, what is the impact of these different city typologies on urban performance and the standards of this 15-minute city model? We see that each of these idealized city types has a representative in a real city layout in a city across the globe. So for example, as I mentioned before, Manhattan for the grid. The fractal city here is the city of La Plata in Argentina, the radial city, Paris, and others. We group our main outcome variables that we will be analyzing in terms of 3 networks that we find in urban environments. So the first network is the network of talent, which means the capabilities and the human capital that we find in a given population in an urban environment. The second layer is the network of organizational structures, which mean the companies and the private and public organizations in a city. And finally, the network of urban infrastructure. So the city layout, the city grid, the street network, the hospitals, universities, and water use and energy systems in a city. So moving on, I will be presenting some examples of these city typologies and some patterns of urban agglomerations that we found very striking and very interesting. And finally, what is the impact of this analysis for cities in general, but the Boston area in particular? So moving to examples of city typologies, as I was mentioning before, we have many idealized city types, the fractal grid for Barcelona, the monumental city of which Brasilia in Brazil and Rome are very good examples, the radial city of Paris, but also examples in Latin American Europe, the organic network for Sao Paulo, and the regular grid of Manhattan or San Francisco, for example. So here we analyze data on the 2-dimensional street layout for Barcelona, and we try to identify based on the data what the different clustering analyses were telling us about the type of grid. In this case, we find a fractal grid, but if we zoom into the different neighborhoods in Barcelona, we find that there are striking similarities across them. So the second to left example, the Eixample, lines up very well with the fractal grid, but the second to last, Sant Montjuïc, does not. So this raises important questions in terms of how accurate is one single typology for a whole city, but also how we can analyze innovation districts or innovation initiatives in subclusters of the cities and how we can measure their different performance. Another example, as I was mentioning before, is the regular grid of New York City. But again, if we zoom into the different neighborhoods, we find that Manhattan lines up very well with this grid, but the Bronx, for example, does not. Again, striking similarities across neighborhoods. Finally, Paris, a very good example of the radial or concentric network. And again, if we move across the different neighborhoods in Paris, we find many differences across them. So we are trying to understand what these different layouts have on the main agglomeration metrics that we find that are valuable and interesting for urban environments. So the most important one in our case is innovation metrics, and we have studied innovations in previous work, both in terms of R&D and patents produced, number of innovative companies, and creation of innovative employment. We find that innovation increases with population density, but the effect tends to die out for high density areas. And similar patterns we find with other metrics, and analyzing roughly 15,000 cities in the US, we find that innovative employment creation is super linear with population growth. And by this, we mean that if you double a city size, it more than doubles its employment in innovative activities. And this has important implications for city planners and city leaders that are trying to attract top talent to their region. Let's talk more about how we can translate this analysis to the Boston area in particular. So we gather many different data sources on urban topology, so the 2-dimensional street network, urban morphology, the 3-dimensional data on the built environment, and urban scale, and we try to summarize them using machine learning and clustering techniques to come with a summarized typology that we can play with and we can analyze. So here are the neighborhoods in Boston, and we found that by clustering based on all of these different data sources, the final clusters, which here we grouped to a reasonable number of 5, tend to line up pretty well with a prior intuition. So Somerville and Cambridge are one cluster, Boston proper, Back Bay, South Boston are another one, Dorchester, Jamaica Plain, Brighton, they group together. We also analyzed the walksheds, so what is the distance, the pedestrian distance between a given point and the amenities around it for different neighborhoods in the Boston area. And here we also found an important and a striking pattern that amenities tend to agglomerate very strongly. So if you look at the distance to the first amenity on the left, it seems to be uniformly distributed across the geography, but then if you calculate the distance to the 10th amenity on the right, then everything clusters very strongly around Boston proper, Cambridge, and Somerville. And this lines up strongly with the results that we had for innovation variables as well. We performed the analysis for different regions, Cambridge, Somerville, Boston, different neighborhoods area. And finally, city typologies. So here we're trying to understand what is the impact of the different city typologies on land area, built area, and the network length, so measures of urban infrastructure use and cost. And we find that the blue dots, which are the organic grid, are always above the pink dots, which are the fractal grids. So fractal grids tend to be extremely efficient in terms of infrastructure use. Not only the slope is lower, but also the intercept is lower. So if you double the size of Barcelona, it will become way more efficient than doubling the size of, for example, Charlotte in North Carolina, which is more like an organic grid. Not only that, if you had to design a city from scratch, if you started with a fractal grid, you would have immediate efficiency benefits. And here are the idealized types, being the grid fractal, Washington, D.C., a good example, and Charlotte, North Carolina, being an example of the organic grid. So to sum up, we are studying the impact of city layouts on the 15-minute standards. We find that there are superlinear benefits of agglomeration of city types in terms of innovation metrics and amenities. We find that city form layout has a large impact on economies of scale by city type. And in ongoing research, we're trying to understand what is the impact on urban performance, in particular in terms of subclusters, innovation districts, and the impact on other sustainability metrics such as pollution and transportation. So we would like to thank everyone for participating in this conversation. We are more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. You can contact us directly or join us in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening. It's my great pleasure to be here today at this year's BARI conference. I will present on behalf of our research team. The project for today is Rhythm of Streets, a street classification framework based on pedestrian activity patterns. Let me briefly introduce our team. We are an interdisciplinary team consisting of researchers from urban studies, computer science, and data science. We aspire to utilize emerging urban data and analytical approaches to improve our understanding, management, and design of cities. First, I will quickly go through the main idea of our project without getting into too much technical details. As a living tissue connecting urban spaces, streets play significant roles in driving city development, providing essential access, and promoting human interactions. Understanding pedestrian activities and how these activities vary across different streets is critical for designing both efficient and livable streets. So Rhythm of Streets is a street classification framework that categorizes Boston's street segments into 10 types based on their pedestrian activity rhythms. The diagram illustrates the basic idea we implement in this research. Using de-identified and privacy-enhanced mobility data, we represent the temporal patterns of pedestrian activities happening on Boston's street segments. The patterns include both the total volume of pedestrian activities and the fluctuation of activity amounts on an hourly basis. Then we apply a group of algorithms to classify the street segments based on these patterns, and we review 10 distinct activity-based street types. This exemplifies activity-based street types in Back Bay. We can see that the one on the upper right shows a street segment on the Newbury Street, one of the busiest commercial streets in Boston. It belongs to the leisure vibrant type, denoting a leisure-driven pattern with a high activity volume. On the contrary, the bottom left one represents a typical walk vibrant street segment, which is bounded by office buildings and office activities. Understanding the street dynamics can potentially inform smarter urban management and improve future street design. After this first glance, I will talk about why we do this and how we did it. Cities have adopted different street classification frameworks to capture street networks, functions, and characteristics. These frameworks guide allocation of transportation resources, regional planning, and design of livable streetscapes. There are two main groups of classification frameworks, functional and contextual. Functional street classification frameworks focus on streets' roles in the transportation network. And contextual street classification frameworks addresses streets' locations and adjacent land uses. For Boston, the primary functional one in use is the CFCC code by US Census Bureau, which classifies street segment into primary roads, secondary road, local road, and so on. In 2013, in order to address the public life missed in the functional classification framework, Boston Complete Street Design Guidelines introduced a contextual framework which proposed types like downtown commercial and neighborhood main street. However, the application of this framework is limited in two ways. It only includes several example streets for each tab, and it used a more crude spatial unit, street, rather than street segments. Thus, a complete fine-grained street classification framework that captures the dynamic of public life is needed for better understand, management, and design streets for all. So how we did it? Thanks to the great open data ecosystem built by the City of Boston and the General Hub and support from Cubic's Data for Good program, we were able to turn our idea into reality. We represent pedestrian activity rhythms with both their weekly total volume and hourly patterns. They apply a two-step classifying procedure. First, based on the weekly total volume, we extracted the segment with extreme low volumes and named them subdued. And then we cluster the rest segments into calm, moderate, and vibrant groups using a fuzzy C-means clustering algorithm. The map shows the spatial distribution of each volume group. We can see clear differences across different groups. For example, the vibrant group mainly occupies the downtown neighborhoods of Boston, which aligns with our knowledge of the city. Step 2 is a classifying process purely based on the up and downs of our activities amount. It reviews three pattern groups: walk, leisure, and hybrid. Each of them is denoted by a distinct daily and weekly pattern. Finally, by combining volume and pattern groups, we got our final activity-based street tabs. Subdued, walk calm, leisure calm, and hybrid calm. Walk moderate, leisure moderate, and hybrid moderate. And finally, walk vibrant, leisure vibrant, and hybrid vibrant. I will conclude by discussing potential applications of this research. Based on our investigation into each activity-based street tabs, they have distinct patterns of use, diversity, and crime counts, which means the tabs can be used to inform more aspects of urban public lives. Meanwhile, understanding the pedestrian activity patterns of street can help cities better manage services like trash and recycling schedules. Moreover, by linking these activity patterns and the physical characteristic of street segment can help us plan and design future streets. Thank you so much for being here and listening our presentation. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or looking for any collaborations. We would love to chat.
Hi, my name is Chris Kushel. I'm with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which is the regional planning agency for the Metro Boston area. And I'm going to be presenting on some analysis we've done that falls under the category of retrofitting the suburbs, by which I mean taking our typical single-use, autocentric, monotonous suburban forms and redeveloping them to meet the needs of our future. I think it's important to note a couple things. First, that the suburbs will continue to be a major source of growth in our region's future. And second, that being said, they can't grow in the same ways that they have done in the past for a whole host of reasons, ranging from environmental concerns to the implications of demographic changes to changing cultural preferences. And finally, as we have a greater recognition of the need to create a more equitable environment and grapple with issues of racial justice, it's imperative that we both increase our supply and diversity of housing options. So within this broad framework of retrofitting suburbia and these huge needs, we decided to focus specifically on the Humble Strip Mall and related auto-centric retail centers. And we did that for a few reasons. First, they're ubiquitous. Second, they're often underutilized by various measures. They also tend to be fairly small, and so they can be redeveloped fairly quickly, but at the same time, they're often clustered together, so they give the opportunity over the long term to see multiple redevelopments and create a neighborhood. And then finally, from a practical standpoint, they tend to be politically easier to affect change in these types of commercial areas rather than in a single family district. Now, the retrofits of strip malls, they can be as simple as adding food trucks or an open air market into an existing strip mall to try and give a little bit of a sense of place to the area, to something that is truly transformative when you have a very large property and have a long time horizon. But most just fall somewhere in the middle. And so here's just one simple example down in Dedham, south of Boston. The owner of this property, of the strip mall, it's less than an acre, so it's quite small, but he decided to redevelop it into a mixed-use development. And here's a rendering and part of the site plan. You can see by itself, it's a small project, but I think it's an example that could be replicated to great effect. And I'd note that in this example, what they did as part of the site plan was they put part of the orientation actually into the rear of the building with pedestrian connections in the back, which actually connect to a grocery store. And next to that is the Legacy Place Lifestyle Center. And along the quote unquote front, they actually buffered it, which is along a highway. So as part of our analysis, we had three components to it. And I want to credit my colleague, Caitlin Spence, who did all of the modeling and analytical work as it relates to this. First, we want to know how much land is actually devoted to strip malls in our region. I caveat that we had to make some assumptions in terms of how we actually determined that, but we came up with over 3,000 sites, comprising more than 10.5 square miles of developable land. So even after taking out wetlands or steep slopes, et cetera. So that's equivalent to a pretty large chunk of space. It's the equivalent to a major part of Boston, ranging from the northernmost part by Sullivan Square all the way down to the JFK and Jackson Square T stations and essentially everything in between that area. Our region is then divided into sub-region, and so here we want to look at how that distribution was, and you can see it's actually fairly distributed equally throughout the sub-regions. We then wanted to know how much development could occur theoretically in this area, in these areas, and we were assuming it was mixed-use development for a couple of reasons. Among them, we wanted to, there are concerns as it relates to commercial displacement. And so we wanted to kind of assume that at least the existing commercial space would still be there. And we want to put our focus on housing because that's where some of our greatest needs are. And so what we did was we created a whole host of assumptions, things like height, for example. And then we applied these different assumptions first to all the different communities in our region, according to the character of each of those communities. And then within each of those communities, if there was transit, we would have another set of assumptions. So for example, if you're near transit, you would expect to see less parking required, as well as if a development or a site was along a principal arterial roadway, often those can be denser than in, let's say, a place like a small downtown area. So we came up with nearly 3,000 housing units that if every single one of these properties was redeveloped, could accommodate. So again, this isn't to suggest that every property should be developed, but it's to give us sort of a sense for the magnitude and the opportunity. The final part of the analysis then was we wanted to take all those sites, those 3,000 plus sites, and sort of give a bit of a ranking to help understand which ones were most suited to redevelopment based upon a whole number of factors. And this diagram here is just showing what that suitability analysis, what went into that. So things such as if there was transit, how many jobs were accessible by transit. So that would be given a very highly weighted score. So we did that throughout the region. This just shows one example on the municipal level where it identifies the sites and shows that relative scoring for each of the identified sites. So we think that this analysis, it could be used for in a number of ways. Just as one example, municipal planners could use this to help prioritize their planning efforts to figure out which areas to focus on a rezoning effort. Rezoning is often one of the biggest barriers that are hindering redevelopment today. So we're now working on creating a digital platform to make this information available. It'll include not only the actual suitability scores, but also a number of the measures that went into that so that people can see kind of what went into it and what some of the implications of certain redevelopments could be. Hopefully this tool will be released by mid-May. We're also working on a pilot project with one of our communities to take this analysis and to use it to actually identify and overcome barriers to redevelopment. So thank you, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks. I'm going to give everyone just a minute to transition and come back on camera. Hi. Now is the part where it gets tough and we have to have a conversation with each other. Thank you so much for those great presentations. I know it's really challenging to try to put all of your research into 7 minutes. So again, I'm going to encourage the audience, if you have questions or thoughts, please share those through the Q&A mechanism, and those will get fed to us and we'll be able to chat about them. But what I want to do is sort of start the conversation with a few questions for our panelists that are focused less on the details of each presentation and more on like some of the themes, and I would say some of the challenges. I know some of the folks in the audience, some of you are new to me, but I'm an advocate. I'm not a researcher. And so my question is always, how can research be used in the public sphere? How does it become applicable? And the place I want to start with for the panelists, start with the hard question is, where do you think that there are, for each of you, where were the limitations in the data in your research? Where did you hit an edge and said the data can, no longer tell me something that I want to know? And then I'm curious if any of you talked to people to try to fill those gaps. This is a critical thing we do at Livable Streets, checking in with community, gut checking assumptions. So yeah, this is more a process question, but I think it leads into sort of the applicability of the research later on. So I'm curious if anyone wants to jump into this hard question about where was the edge of the data you were using and how did that impact your work?
Well, I can say a thing or two on our end. We made extensive use of open data portals for that, and that I believe is very important for us because you always think about public services in terms of infrastructure and roads and buildings, but actually, public infrastructure regarding curated and clean and available data. That's extremely helpful for us, not only from the public sector, but also from other researchers and NGOs and people that are working on making this data available. And yes, we are always hitting some limits as to what data can be used. And you can see a sample of that in the current panel where you see many creative uses of data. And I guess there are mainly two edges that we're always trying to push. One is data quality, and the second one is creative uses of currently available data, because there are always new ways to think about how to answer old questions with the data that is available, but maybe you need a little bit more creativity in the ways that you combine them.
I could jump in on a couple of thoughts as well. I think the limitations were twofold as part of this work. Well, first of all, again, I'm also not a researcher, so I just want to, again, just give a ton of credit to my colleague, Caitlin Spence, who was the one that had to deal with all of the data. And we're dealing with, looking at our region is 101 cities and towns in the Metro Boston area. So we're looking at thousands upon thousands of sites, and it's just unfortunately wasn't feasible to kind of do that kind of on the ground, looking in every community. Do we have that right? So I think we probably have some parcels that are probably not appropriate in the data, and some that maybe we're missing. But I hope that on the overall scale, we're pretty much on track. The other limitation, though, is this data doesn't actually solve the problem. And even if we identify the area for redevelopment, and even if redevelopment occurs, the quality of redevelopment is really what matters. So it's not just about plunking, a multifamily building down, surrounded by a sea of parking with no transit or walkability to get to the site. And so, that's other work that I'm hoping, is separate. But I think it's important to acknowledge that our research doesn't solve that problem.
Yep, I would also like to I would like to first reflect on the point Fernando and Chris mentioned. Actually, the first point I want to mention is a creative use of existing data, especially the open data, either by the government or by other researchers. We always first, Boston have a great open data portal and a great community. But still, always what is important is what's your real problem or what's your real question, and then how to use existing data. There's I always see the open data as a mine. You can always get a lot of values and other public good from that. And second point on the limitation of our research, I think not only the data, because I think it's not always the data produce a limitation, and actually most of the time it's the choices of the researcher or the people who use the data. For example, the spatial and temporal unit you use, or like the analyst period. So I think one key limitation I would like to mention is, and also what we want to do in the future is try to apply the framework we propose for Boston to other cities where less open data exists. This is where we see the potential of this like big data set can really produce in like less developed or even the places with less data and more rural areas. And the second limitation or like a future direction is do more field work. It's like just get into your street and see what are on the ground. Because there's like recent years see a rapid growing trend of this urban big data research, and they're also part of them are just getting a data set and we do the analysis and then done. But some of the research like ignore people on the ground, like ignore the real situation and their real pains. But it's great to see there's a growing trend of research that is just combining like the big data research and intensive field work. So it's also, I see a limitation of this research and what I want to do or we want to do in the future to improve it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna ask a follow-up question out of curiosity. Did any of you do site visits or walkthroughs of the places that you studied or shared in the Boston area? Yes. No?
I think it's quite related to the point I just made. Is yes, since we did a framework on classifying the street segments, and we did work on a lot of street segments on Boston, either on purpose or just by chance. And we also use this knowledge, use the local knowledge, and also our knowledge of design and planning to see whether the result makes sense. For example, if a street like with a lot of offices and very vibrant be classified in like a subdued type, we say no, it doesn't make sense. Like it's something wrong here. So we definitely visit the street, and that part of knowledge, which is not very represented in the research or in the paper, in the presentation, is actually crucial for getting the right results, getting the results that make real sense. Yeah.
Yes, the
Yes,
advocacy
yeah.
hearing. Go ahead, Fernando.
I think that's a very good question. Fortunately, when we're working in Boston, the Boston area, that's sort of like a plus because we can do it, but we're like broadly based. That's unfortunately not the case. But in that scenario, actually, one thing that we haven't thought about it in our team, but during COVID ended up being super important, is that our team is very diverse also in terms of like the geographic distribution of the team. So actually having someone that is from, like, for example, I'm from Latin America, or like another team member is from Paris. So, they're very, that ended up being very important for our work, to have, as you're saying, a more intuitive pass on like the smell test of whether the quantitative results make sense.
Our on-the-ground work, I guess, started after the initial analysis, and so we wanted to take that analysis and see, could it actually be useful? And so we've had one partner community to use the analysis and say, okay, here's a cluster of, according to the analysis, highly suitable sites. Now let's dig down deep. And so that's what we're kind of in the process now of doing a pilot project and on that site to see, does it make sense? And then ultimately, as I mentioned before, what would the actual sort of characteristics of future redevelopment entail to allow this to be a walkable sort of neighborhood?
Yeah. Thank you. This is going to lead into my next question. I always ask about, how researchers sort of got their hands dirty, because it's another data set, right? I also think it's interesting, and I would imagine some of you have run into this, particularly some of the walkability data. Cell phone data won't tell you if a mom is walking with her 2 kids, right? Like that won't tell you the age, some of those things that actually make something great. And so I love sort of seeing these good intersections, because then you get the best possible result. And this is going to shift into my next question, which is where I'm going to steal this sentence from you, Chris. Data doesn't solve the problem. This is, again, as an advocate, we point to studies, we point to research a lot, but then we just like bump up against political will. And so I'm curious how you envision the research that you're all doing, impacting the public discourse, or helping get over some of these political hurdles that keep us from building really great walkable 15-minute communities, keep us from building really great mixed use, mixed income, TOD housing. I'm curious how you see this work being applied in the real world. And anyone can jump in and start.
Well, I guess on our end, the way we see this problem is that at least we're trying to identify which sort of political struggles or political negotiations are not zero sum. Because if the problem is zero sum, basically you're in the worst of all worlds. And basically, it could end in a stalemate where if group A wins, then group B loses. So that's kind of complicated. But in many of these phenomena that we're studying, that's actually not zero sum, because we see that the total pie is growing. So there's like a natural tendency of agglomeration of amenities, economic activity, innovation, patents, R&D. So that's actually an increase in the size of the pie. So it might be the case that in a particular scenario, group A seems that it's a net loss, but if the total pie is growing, there's room for negotiation. So we believe that, in many of these cases, such as like redevelopment, as Chris was mentioning, or identifying the different types of roads, as in Tanya's work, putting a number of that change in the pie is very important, because then you actually have some evidence to argue that the game is not zero sum. So then there's room to start a conversation. And the other thing I think helps in our case, we also try to work a lot with these city typologies, or in the case of Tanya's work, which is the typologies of the road activity. Actually putting a name and a number of these typologies is also useful, because it provides a framework to start a conversation. So I think those two ideas are helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. As I said, I'm not a researcher, and while I'm not an advocate per se, I'm maybe in between. And most of my work is spent trying to help facilitate and set the conditions for mixed-use TOD, downtown style development. So I think this research that we worked on specifically, if you don't think that there's a problem, and if you don't think that suburbs need to grow or need to grow differently, this research isn't going to solve that. There's other research out there that can hopefully help with that discourse. I think where this can play a role, though, is twofold. On the macro scale or the regional scale, I think it can help with the narrative, because we look at what our needs are for growth, and we can see that we can accommodate almost all of that within areas that are already developed. We don't have to cut down trees to kind of meet our growth needs. We don't have to encroach upon, potentially beloved neighborhoods. We can develop in areas that, a lot of people aren't, are generally functional and often underutilized. So I think that that's one aspect that might be able to help. And then as you zoom in, especially on the municipal level, there are very limited resources within communities to think about things like, where do we rezone? Where do we want to grow? Again, assuming that you do acknowledge that there's a problem, this can help focus you. Like, where should we really be looking for the best sort of bang for your buck, if you will?
Yes, I would also like to answer the question. It's really a great question, and it's obviously always a difficult task. Actually, we standing on more on a researcher's perspective, we try to overcome it in basically two ways. First, we departed from learning about what is existing and what is in use nowadays, rather than do something from scratch. So for example, in the Rhythm of Street project, we started from investigating the current functional street classification framework, which is Census Code 1, and the contextual one from Boston's Complete Street Design Guidelines. Which make us possible to take use of the emerging data and measure to complement the existing system rather than like totally replacing them. There will definitely be difficulties in integrating the existing ones and the proposed ones, definitely. And but we hope to create extra public good by doing the research or proposing and advocating for the walkable streets. Just like what Fernando had mentioned, it's not a zero-sum game. We hope like our research, our project, or our approaches can create some extra public value and public good. So we think like a willingness to really co-create a more walkable and better future is probably the key, and with hope,
Well, this gets right into the next question I have, which is really about the future. I think what is interesting is, there will be another BARI conference a year from now. There's always a ton of research, and then there's another edge of the research. And so I'm curious from your perspective, there's obviously, you all had very sort of unique perspectives, but there's also a direction or a lens or sort of a perspective that you all had. And I'm sort of curious what you think, sort of what the research and policy community, because we have both voices at the table here, what the work should look like in the next year to advance the conversation around equitable, walkable communities. So, whether it's in your personal research or sort of what the industry as a whole needs to do, I'm curious what you think is next, or what we don't quite have our hands wrapped around yet.
Well, I guess on our end, one thing we saw is that there's kind of like in the air this idea of densification and sort of suburban redevelopment and the 15-minute city, but we're trying to make a great effort in trying to quantify or provide a little bit more structure to that conversation. So what does a 15-minute city mean exactly? What variables exactly are you trying to target? How do you measure them? What is the measurement problem in those variables? How do you measure success? Because so we're trying to provide a more rigid framework for that to avoid the problem where we're always moving the goalpost. So, it's hard to say whether we're making progress or not. And it's a very interesting problem because these are not super quantifiable things, as you mentioned, like how do you measure like a mom going through a road with a stroller? Like it's very hard to do that. Only a human being and most human beings even can't. But it's a very interesting problem. So I guess on our end, we are trying to move in that direction.
Go ahead.
Yep. Yeah, I can go ahead. Yeah, I would say from my perspective, I think first, it's still raising the awareness of our topic we are advocating. I think all of our three presentations today actually did a great job for that. First, you need to raise awareness of the need of a 15-minute city community and densifying the suburban and also a more pedestrian-friendly street, both in the public and in the government, and probably also in the academia. And then you can have the possibility of really pushing it. I think the second is more pushing a little bit more on the evidence-based and data-informed policymaking. It's definitely not a linear process of decision making. Like now you get the data and you got the result, and then you know what to do. But it's always a non-linear. But I still want to say know a little bit more and knowing a little bit less best information is always helpful. We actually need a closer collaboration between different sectors and stakeholders, both as administrative collaboration and data collaboration. Actually, our research is only possible based on the collaboration between the open data system and some private data, some de-identified private data. So definitely would like to see more of this kind of collaboration, which can pushing the boundary of evidence-based planning, design, and policymaking.
Awesome.
Yeah, I guess I don't have too much to add, but I guess from my perspective on the research side, I think there's some opportunities to take this research we've done and go a little further and really kind of see whether we got things right. If we're missing, do we need to kind of scrub the data? And I think that might be sort of version 2.0. And I think there are some other sort of analytical pieces we could bring to that would hopefully help advocates and other sort of potential change makers as it relates to this. But I think, more broadly, just this is sort of one piece to the puzzle to kind of keep sort of doing what we're trying to do, which is affect change. And as you know, that's very difficult to achieve. And I would say, in the suburbs, probably even more hard than in Boston. In Boston, maybe we're arguing over how much height we should have or how much affordability, whereas in many suburbs, it's whether there should be anything at all. So we're trying to just kind of incrementally chip away at that, I think, and in appropriate locations, redevelop.
It's great. Well, we have just about 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna close with a question for all of you, and then as a reminder to the attendees, if this has sparked questions or thoughts, please throw them in the Q&A, and we might be able to squeeze something in right at the end. But my last question always in these sessions is, what did you learn from each other, and what are you taking away, or what do you want the audience to take away from this discussion? Even if it's supposed to be a fun chat, I like takeaways, I like next steps. So yeah, I'm curious what you all learned from each other and what you want people to know. And I don't care who starts. If anyone is burning to jump in, please go ahead.
I guess on our end, one thing that is very clear is that there are great minds working in very interesting problems, and more than interesting relevant problems, because great minds always work in interesting problems, but you don't always have the great minds working relevant problems. And that's important for us, because in terms of this conversation on sharing data and data quality and curating data, it's there are a lot of network externalities, and this incentivizes us to share our data, and then we'll have conversations with other organizations or researchers. So that's very encouraging for us. And I guess one takeaway on our end is that we are always trying to provide a framework to analyze the Boston area in particular, but other cities in general. And we're trying to see the commonalities. So not to think as Boston or the US as its own separate specimen with its own laws, but there's actually a lot of, natural laws that you see in the ways that cities grow and cities innovate. So we're trying to bring that perspective and trying to analyze, the city of Boston as, an individual animal within a species to try to understand the commonalities.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. And I totally agree with everything that was mentioned. And I like kind of the phrasing of it's not just interesting problems, but relevant problems. And, just for me, the takeaway, just listening to, the other two conversations and presentations was, there's so many different lenses and skills that can be brought to kind of solving these different issues. And so just fascinating to see all the different kind of ways we can kind of approach these problems. So thanks for that.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it's a really great point. I think that the one thing I really appreciate and learn from Chris and Fernando is really getting your hand dirty and getting more details and knowledge from local. And if there's one takeaway from my end, I would say there's like streets, all other urban environment are environment for all, not only for one kind of like vehicle or one group of person, group of population. There's a lot of other population or activities or needs are still missing in the current framework, and there's a lot of things we need to do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Of course, right at the end of this, I have a siren going off in the back, so I apologize if anyone can hear that. The joys of Zoom conferences. I also, sorry, I'm trying to also read the questions at the exact same time.
I had my 5-year-old poking his head in it now, so I know what it's like.
The joys of Zooming. Question. The question that was presented to me is how I see these projects as useful as advocates for equitable streets and places. So, and this sort of ties into how I'd like to leave things as we wrap up. I have often found being in a city like Boston is we are research rich and we are data rich. And if I ever need a student to do anything, I don't have trouble finding one, which is a benefit. But it's why I started with the first question around like, did you talk to people? Did you think about the limits of the data? Because it's a double-edged sword, right? As advocates, and I think this is true for folks who operate in the political sphere, people who sort of are out trying to do things, we need information to make decisions. We need information to make our case. I don't get very far if I just tell a story always about a mother trying to move around, but if I can demonstrate that there's data, that something backs me up, that the thing that I'm speaking to exists, it's important. But on the flip side of that, some of the things that I particularly around the walkability of the urban context, when researchers don't ask sort of multi-contextual, sort of experiential questions at the beginning, then the data is biased, right? It is possible no data exists without sort of that biased contextualization of the people who are asking the questions in the first place. I think the discussion around open source data is like, this is so valuable, but also where did it come from and what's the quality and why did we ask for this kind of data in the first place? And what data did we not collect at all? And then how does that produce the end result? As an advocate, those are the questions I care about, because without that contextualization, you can end up with like a really weird or really inaccurate result. And so, I think my takeaway, I can't believe I'm ending right on time in this, is that I think this, if everyone here really cares about walkable communities that do actually benefit everyone and do have sort of that multicultural, multi-experiential context, then we have to be willing to toggle between the data and the experience, and that it's a loop that speaks to each other, and that without sort of the experience and the contextualization, the data sort of means nothing. But like, if you don't have something to anchor that planning or that future in, then you can also use an antidote to take you down the wrong path. And And so the openness to constantly ask questions on either side of the spectrum is how advocates, I think, move successfully. And I think how we work really collaboratively with the research community. So I hope that the takeaway folks are taking this exciting work to dig in to and to think about what the future can look like, and to also work together to actually make it happen. I would really love to thank our panel for being willing to engage in this conversation, to share your amazing research. I know you had a lot of research partners. I think some of them are in the virtual space with us today. I want to thank Bari for hosting this great conversation, and turn it back over to David.
Awesome, guys. I want to thank you all for this amazing hour that we just had. This is amazing, and I hope all our attendees really appreciate this work. We really appreciate your work here at Bari. I want to thank each and every one of you individually. This was just an amazing feat, and I want to encourage you to continue doing the work that you do day in and day out. We do want to thank everyone for attending today's conference, and we hope that everyone will be able to attend next week's keynote, a mayoral conversation. It's very important that we encourage everyone to attend, because this is something that you don't want to miss. So please stay tuned for that. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at bari@northeastern.edu. We want to thank everyone, and we hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hello, folks. Good afternoon.